Welcome to class number 1 in the Information Risk course at UCLA Extension. We're going to be going over the basic risk model. This is a revisiting of some of the material that was discussed in the intro class of security. It's a risk model that is implied in what the textbook and what the NIST project that you'll be working on have for their framework, but I'm emphasizing it as a separate standalone entity for the moment, just to wrap things up and give you some introduction to what we'll be doing in the rest of the class. Risk management definitions. An information asset is data and software having value or providing value to the organization. It's the more abstract information that provides value. Whereas an IT asset is anything that's owned by IT, hardware, software, facilities, etc. Many information assets are managed by IT or reside on IT assets, reside on hardware and software that is owned by IT. So there's a very close relationship between IT risk and the risk to information owned by the organization. A securities threat is something that may cause harm to IT assets, generally thought of as an intentional human agency, though it can be an unintentional human agency, meaning somebody makes a mistake, or it could be a non-human agency in some cases. Things like floods, fires, electrical outage can be considered security threats, even though they're generally not something that has any sort of intentional human force behind them. A security vulnerability. You should have safeguards to prevent your assets from being exploited by a threat. The lack of a safeguard, something that allows a threat to be realized, that allows a threat to be successful and cause harm, is a vulnerability. It's a weakness in your defense. A countermeasure is something additional you do to reduce the impact of the risk. And you do this either by reducing the likelihood that the threat will cause harm to you, or, assuming that the threat is realized, reduce the amount of harm in the event of an incident. Now, how do you get the facts to find out, to set up your risk assessment here? Where do you get this information? We've got a great abstract model here, but where's the real data come from? Well, how do you find out what your information assets are? One thing that you might want to look at is interviews with business executives. Sit down with folks, set up structured interviews, and say, what do you consider to be the most valuable information used by this company? Is there information that requires, say, secrecy, trade secret information? Is there information that helps us to be more productive, to gain a competitive advantage? Is there information, if improperly used, would subject us to regulatory fines? Talking to various levels of management, and particularly executives, can help wield this sort of information. Another source of information for information assets is the Configuration Management Database, or CMDB. The CMDB is a concept introduced by the ITIL, IT Service Framework. ITIL stands for IT Infrastructure Library. It's an overarching framework and explanation and way of mapping out IT as a service provider to the rest of the organizations. Practices from service management underlying the model of IT service. Behind the various services provided and defined by ITIL, incident management, etc., is a database of IT resources, because this database of IT resources is what is managed through the various service disciplines of change management, release management, etc., and so forth. As many companies attempt to implement ITIL as a best practice and framework for IT services, you're seeing large numbers of companies also produce something that they call a configuration management database. And this is something that folks in the security field can leverage for your list of information assets as well as IT assets as part of your risk management fact-finding. Security threats. You can find out about security threats from the news, just your normal business press or your normal the press at large reports on security incidents, big security incidents like the ones that have afflicted several companies in the last few years, get very good write-ups in the business press. You can also look at specialized security news sources and technology news sources as well. Industry associations, generally industry associations may have this information, may provide it to their members, and at least, of course, on an informal basis are a good way to find out, what your peers are facing out there, but there are some more formal organizations out there. In specific, there is the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, or ISACs, which have been set up as a collaboration between private industry and the government to gather information on cyber threats and to share throughout the industry some of the threats that your peers and in some cases your competitors are facing. And ISAC is intended to be a safe space for an organization, for security people in an organization to discuss what you're running into, to submit information about various sorts of attacks that have been attempted so that other folks in your industry can prepare better for them. SANS, the Internet Training Powerhouse, also has their Internet Storm Center, or ISC, which is a somewhat different resource but also tends to gather information more about technical threats to organizations. And SANS has some very good newsletters that you can subscribe to via email, and the ISC is a very good website for keeping up on who's attacking whom over the internet. So that's where you can find out about the threats. Threat gathering organizations, there are groups that specialize in gathering information security threat data, the CERT, C-E-R-T, as well as various private organizations, a lot of security vendors, folks like Verizon and IBM, publish information about what they see as the threats facing their clients, and that information is a valuable promotional tool for these organizations that sell security services. Getting these threat papers and reviewing them is an important part of reviewing your security threat environment. Now, security vulnerabilities. What parts of your organization are vulnerable? What sort of things would make you susceptible to a threat? You can find these out by performing scans, by doing automated surveys of devices on your network, your websites, your desktop machines, and so forth. Find out if there's configurations that are lacking in proper security. Find out if there's vulnerable services. There are many automated tools that will do a sweep of your network, a sweep of the devices on your network, and then tell you this is what an attacker would see and this is what they might exploit. And that helps you define certain types of vulnerabilities. You can use audits as another method of finding security vulnerabilities. Audits are very good in finding flaws in processes, procedures, and policies. People who don't do things, or parts of your organizations that don't do things the right way, that may cut corners or may be lacking in certain sorts of security controls at a procedural aspect. Do you do change management properly on your servers? Do you have a proper process for vetting users and for establishing new users and periodically reconciling your users to the folks who are actually authorizing? Penetration tests get lumped in with scans. A penetration test is actually somebody pretending to be a threat and seeing how far they can get. Penetration tests are often technical. They involve somebody trying to hack into servers, hack into devices. They can also be human-based penetration tests where somebody attempts to phone, say, important individuals, executive assistants, and so forth, and see how far they can get into the organization, how much illicit information they can get just by sweet-talking their way through. That's a sort of penetration test as well. So that's how you can find out the vulnerabilities. And in the countermeasures, you look at the sort of things designed to counter the vulnerabilities that you may have found. Procedures, policies, and technology. What do you have in place? What's planned? How good is it? Having a countermeasure is good. A countermeasure with failures in it, with flaws, is a vulnerability. Now here's our basic risk model. We start here with a threat. A threat here on the left. A threat is something that may cause harm to IT assets, as we've defined before. The threat runs across or runs into something that's a vulnerability, which is a lack of a safeguard, something that can be exploited by the threat, a weakness in defense that allows the threat to realize its ultimate aims and goals. This results in an exposure, which is an event that may occur, causing damage and destruction. Threat plus vulnerability means the possibility that something bad can happen. How bad is it? That depends on the value of the asset at risk, the value of the information asset or IT asset. Generally, we're talking about information assets here. So total exposure is really the likelihood of a threat effectively being able to execute times what is at risk for that exposure. Now, to counter this exposure, you have countermeasures. You can implement measures that must reduce the impact of a risk. And this can reduce the impact in two ways. It can either make it less likely that the threat can take advantage of a vulnerability. It can reduce the likelihood or frequency of a successful exposure, or it can reduce the amount of the asset that gets exposed should the event occur. And these are both very good tactics to follow. You want to reduce the likelihood of somebody breaking into your system, but you also want to make an assumption that the vulnerability there will eventually be a vulnerability the threat could exploit. And you want to make sure that when this happens, that the threat agent can only cause the minimum amount of damage feasible. You want to assume that the exposure takes place and minimize the damage to the asset. What you have after you've done all the rational business planning, you've performed the risk model, you've looked at the costs of the countermeasure versus the value of the asset exposed and decided, what is financially the best possible combination that makes sense here, you end up with residual risk. You cannot run any organization without having some risk involved. There's nothing in life that's completely risk-free. What you do is you apply countermeasures up to the point where it still makes sense given the value of what you're protecting, and then you say, this is what we got to live with. And it's important to document this, because if anything else in this model changes in the future, that residual risk may become unacceptable. If the threats increase, if there are suddenly, instead of a small number of folks, large number of folks who have much more resources applying a threat, if new vulnerabilities are found, if the value of the asset changes, that will all affect the residual risk. So you want to track the residual risk over time and make sure it doesn't increase past a point where it's not acceptable to the folks running your organization. Now, risk can be defined quantitatively, and this is basically through something called an annual loss expectancy, which is the loss per incident times the frequency of the incident. The more frequent or the more often you expect a successful threat exposure to occur, the greater the ALE. The more that the asset is exposed, the greater of the ALE. The loss per incident is called the single loss expectancy, or SLO. Note that frequency is a reciprocal of probability. It's called the annualized rate of occurrence, or ARO. If a probability of something occurring is 50% over the course of a year, then the frequency is once every 2 years. Here's an example of a quantitative risk, and I think these numbers are probably pretty reasonable here, though nowadays at 70,000 for hacking is a bit on the low side. You live in Southern California, maybe. You're taking this class through UCLA. If you live in this area, you know something about earthquakes. Earthquakes, let's say they occur, a major one occurs once every 30 years. And if one occurs that causes a significant loss, the loss is, $1.5 million or so. Over that 30-year period, your annual loss expectancy is $50,000 per year. So if you can greatly reduce that loss per incident from an earthquake by spending, say, $10,000 a year, it'd be worth it. Hacking. Suppose somebody successfully breaks into an internal system on an average once a year, and that loss, once you figure in the loss of the data, the cost of staff having to fix things, folks performing forensics and re-imaging servers and so forth at 70,000, that annual loss expectancy would be 70,000 per year. Credit card fraud. Let's suppose you're a retailer or somebody that deals with a lot of credit cards, and 100 times a year you get a transaction that you just can't process because it's completely fraudulent and you have to eat the cost. And let's assume that on the average this is about $500. Somebody makes off with $500 worth of goods using a bogus credit card, and you're stuck. In that case, it happens 100 times a year. 500, it's $50,000 a year is the annual loss expectancy. Actually, $50,000 per year for an annual loss expectancy is redundant. The ALE is $50,000. It's already per year. So here's some examples, of some very, very quick calculations. And the thing to keep in mind is that you're not just looking at the amount of money or the damage to the information asset, you're also looking at charging out the time that your staff spend dealing with the incident or dealing with the event that is pulled away from other productive duties. You're dealing with insurance, you're dealing with regulatory agencies, you're dealing with publicity, so that all factors into the loss per incident. It's not just we lost $70,000 worth of data, it's we lost a certain amount of data, plus we had to pull some very expensive resources to re-image servers and to make sure that that attacker was no longer in our network. Now, risk can be, we've just discussed some quantitative risk assessments. Risk can also be a qualitative thing. And this is generally high, medium, or low. And, you don't even pretend to assign precise dollar amounts to those. You're just kind of getting a sense of what's important, what's not important. Now, the thing to keep in mind is you have to use a strict definition here. You have to define what high, medium, and low mean. And the other thing I found that trips up organizations is you will have vendors and you'll have security assessment products that say certain things are high, medium, and low. And these products all have completely different, inconsistent definitions of high, medium, and low. You have to make sure that if you're relying on a scanning tool or if you've got some third-party assessment going on, that your definitions are normalized, that you're talking about the same type of high and the same type of medium and the same type of low. Here's an example. A high-risk situation may be one where there's a vulnerability that is actively being exploited. We know that there are bad guys actually using this vulnerability to hack into places, and where we have highly sensitive data at risk. A medium vulnerability might be something where the vulnerability is demonstrated but not actively exploited yet. We don't know that anyone could actually is and that any threat agent actually is using this vulnerability, but we know it could be used, and you've got data that isn't particularly sensitive at risk. And in a low one might be where vulnerability is possible but not proven. It's theoretically possible that this software or this cryptographic system could be broken, but no one has yet demonstrated it, and non-sensitive data at risk. What we're getting at here is it's a combination of risk or likelihood and the sensitivity of the target expressed in qualitative terms. Actively exploited, demonstrated, and possible, highly sensitive versus non-sensitive data, etc. So it's a high, medium, and low ranking. You're not so much saying here's the number of dollars we would lose based on this risk. We're saying here is the most important risk to the organization. Here's an example. This is from something called DREAD, which is a threat rating table. It's part of the Microsoft methodology, STRIDE and DREAD. I love these acronyms. DREAD is great. It stands for damage, reproducibility, exploitability, affected users, and discovery. What a perfect acronym for a threat table. And here's how DREAD actually organizes this stuff in terms of the different dimensions of a threat. You've got your damage potential, your reproducibility, exploitability, effective users, and discoverability, dealing with how much harm it can do, how easy it is to reproduce or redo the attack, what sort of skill it takes to do it, what portion of the organization could be affected by this attack, and how easy is it for somebody to figure out how to use this attack against you. And this is a standard. I mean, it's a Microsoft standard, but you can use this, and I think this is actually a pretty good one. It helps you rate your threats using, a table that somebody at Microsoft thought a lot about and put a lot of effort into. Here's another example of a qualitative risk analysis. This is from a company called Fortify, and they make tools for scanning software code, so the source code, like C++, Java, C#, etc., and saying, here's the stuff we found that looks like it could be exploited, and here's our ranking of it. So you've got a matrix of impact by likelihood, and critical is stuff that's high impact, high likelihood, low is low impact, low likelihood, and we need some sort of, to make this complete, we need to define, well, what do you mean by low impact versus high impact? What do you mean by low and high likelihood here? But if you, this is a good first step. If you define those two, you've got a handle on it. So there we have it. This is a summary of what we've got here in terms of the risk model, plus a few hints for you to apply this model practically in your organization.